Give me 1 second.
Sure.
Sorry. Okay. I'd like to on meeting of the Bolton Conservation Commission. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, General Law, Chapter 30A, subsection 18, and the Governor's March 15th, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place, this public meeting of the Bolton Conservation Commission is being conducted via remote participation. No in-person attendance of members of the public will be permitted. The public can access this meeting while in progress by Zoom video communications. Members of the public attending this meeting virtually will be allowed to make comments if they wish to do so during the portion of the hearing designated for public comment by telephone, cell phone, or personal computer using Zoom. That said, we will begin as we always do with a roll call vote. With a roll call, I am Brian Barabee.
Emily Winter.
William Payne.
And Rebecca Longpaw.
Okay. So first up this evening, the Bolton Conservation Commission will now open a public hearing under the provisions of Mass General Law, Chapter 131, Section 40, and the Bolton Bylaw, Chapter 233, for a request for determination of applicability for 19A Mill Pond Road in Bolton. Is someone here representing the applicant, Rebecca?
There is. Just before we hand it off to them, though, Brian, I would just like to remind those who are participating in the meeting today to please change your display name to your first and last legal name so that we have it for the records in the minutes. And additionally, if it is not your hearing item and you have not been recognized from the chair, please remain on mute. Otherwise, I will have to mute you. And you can use the raise hand function, the chat function, or simply wave your hand and I will be monitoring the call. So all of that being said, Seth is present, I see, and I believe he is representing the applicant. Brian, if you want him to provide a summary.
Seth, if you are here, that would be fantastic if you could start us off.
Hey, good evening, Commission members. This is Seth Donahoe with Dillis and Roy. Also with me tonight is Peter Given. He's the applicant. And this is for lot 19 on Mill Pond Road, so in Century Mill Estates. It is one of the last undeveloped lots of the current phase of the project. And as you're going up the road, this is on the left. At one time, it was the job site trailer site. So the site has an existing detention basin to the rear of it. And then there's a bordering vegetated wetland located beyond that detention basin. So we've submitted an RDA for approval of the grading and house placement, which is all outside the 100-foot buffer zone. Our limit of work is approximately 170 feet from the BVW. And again, the stormwater management basin exists in between our limit of work and the BVW. So the site, as I mentioned, it was a job site trailer. Portions of it had a parking area on it. So one of the benefits of bringing this to its final finished grade will be to also stabilize that parking area, which was a gravel parking area. So that'll be loamed and seeded as is typical with most of the backyards in that neighborhood. And we've prepared a separate RDA plan for this site, and it specifies a temporary construction entrance as well as protection of the existing catch basins, because those are all functional within the roadway. So we're proposing silt sacks within those during construction, an erosion control barrier at the rear of the site to prevent any sediment from getting to the basin. And then we also have the temporary construction entrance. And Century Mill Estates is a little bit unique in that there are numerous shared septic systems there. And this is one of those lots. So while we show some dash lines for a reserve area, that's actually a portion of the permitting elements for the Board of Health. The septic system is actually already constructed and it's on the adjacent lot. So we will not be doing any major earthwork for that. So again, the alterations are over 170 feet from the wetlands. So we're asking the commission if they could issue a negative determination for this lot. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Okay. Rebecca, do you have any history for this project? Is this the site in general where there was a leak at one point?
There was, and that's exactly why Seth was very proactive in calling and to see if there were any concerns or if a filing would be necessary, just understanding the proximity to the resource area, which is back here, if you can see my cursor. And that there is stormwater infrastructure between the resource area and where they're proposing to put the single family home. And part of the concern is that, yes, there was a diesel fuel spill at one point here. It has since been addressed. However, the reasoning for the RDA is to ensure that there are erosion controls in place, there's appropriate grading and stabilization on site so that we don't have another issue where the water is actually circumventing the stormwater system and going straight into the wetland. And again, to note, since that spill, there's been some work done on the basin itself and some grading in the area as well to try and mitigate that so it wouldn't occur again. But because we've already seen it happen once, under the Wetlands Protection Act, if it is going to impact the wetland resource area, even though it's outside of that 100-foot buffer under the Wetlands Protection Act, under our rules and bylaw, it's a resource area in itself. This area becomes jurisdictional. So I figured it's best just to be upfront about it. And I think Seth did the right thing to call and just have that addressed by the commission versus having something occur down the line. The other bit of history about this project is that the roadway itself and some of the infrastructure is under an existing order of conditions, but where this is technically outside of the commission's jurisdiction and under the reasons I just listed, really why it's before us this evening, an RDA I think is appropriate versus having it covered under the existing order of conditions.
Okay. Still trying to think. Any commission members have initial questions for this? Not seeing any yet. Oh. Go ahead, Bill. Did you have a question? I'm sorry.
No, I don't have any other questions.
Okay. It seems pretty cut and dry to me what we're seeing here. The one thing I would ask is if trying to remember exactly where this site is and where it gets down into the resource area. And I'd almost be curious just to have a site visit, just to go out and give it another look. What I'm seeing on these plans looks appropriate for what has happened there in the past. And I think it does make sense to have the standalone RDA. But if possible, I think I just want to go out and take a look at the site. I don't have any other really initial questions right now. Rebecca, do you have any additional questions right now?
Oh, I do not. I see, actually, as I say that, is this a wattle here, Seth? Adjacent to the siltation?
It's a wattle and a silt fence is the proposed barrier.
Okay.
And
so
if
that
the
was.
commission would like something else, we'd be happy to provide that, but that seems to be the standard that you guys have been asking for.
Okay. And then what's being proposed as far as land? Is there landscaping between the silt fence and then the basin itself, or is that within the drainage easement?
That's within the drainage easement. So our limit of work is actually, it coincides with the drainage easement area. So that whatever goes on beyond the silt fence would be a element of the original permit for the subdivision. And truthfully, I don't have an answer if that was supposed to be planted with anything or if it just seeded with a basin mix.
Okay, so I guess that would be my only question is on the portion that this property owner is responsible for. What are they planning to do? Is it going to be lawn all the way back, or are they proposing to do some sort of a mix? Again, and my real concern is this area here, where we see the grade sort of change slightly. But that's my only other question.
Well, the applicant is in attendance. If you would like to discuss any landscaping requirements, I'm sure they'd appreciate that. And while we certainly don't object to a site visit, we did file the RDA in anticipation of submitting a building permit request. And we'd ask if we could proceed with the building permit request while that site visit is taking place so that the actual construction of the house is not delayed. Again, the house is essentially 200 feet from the wetlands, so we'd hope we could proceed with that work.
So Seth, just to clarify, are you, and remind me because we have obviously multiple building permits, did you already submit the building permit or you haven't done so yet?
So I have no involvement in the building permit process.
We have not submitted it yet.
Okay, so just to be clear, I mean, it is beneficial to find out at times if the commission, if you're even able to build something before you pull that building permit, but you're able to start that process. It's just I can't sign off on the permit. So the conservation department can't sign off on it until the commission approves it here. But you can certainly start gathering other department signatures and start that process through the viewpoint system as we're doing the site visits or finding out more information, just so you know.
Rebecca, could you put the cover page of the actual RDA application package up? Because that has an aerial photo on it.
Let me, bear with me for one moment.
No problem.
Actually, do you want me to just pull it from the website? That might be easier.
I have like an Oliver image, or if I can share my screen, I'll pull that up because I think that'll answer a lot of the questions regarding the site and the perspective to surrounding properties.
Okay, let me. This lot here, right?
Yeah, so that represents what I'm trying to get across there. So it is an existing used area, and essentially all the surrounding lots have lawns going almost essentially right up to the basin, and that's not even what we're proposing here. So I'm just asking, I know the applicant's willing to work with you, but we'd also like to be able to move through the process. So we can certainly meet out there, and if there's some landscaping needed, we'd certainly be able to add that to the plans. But it's just not really consistent to what's going on in that neighborhood.
Sure, and I was just curious about that. That was, like I said, my only question, whether or not the commission wants to act on that, that's fine. Yeah, so here's the basin. If you follow my cursor, and then you have basically their limit of work is behind the trailer that was there, and I don't think this is an up-to-date image. But basically from that forward is your limit of work. Is that correct, Seth?
That's correct, yes. And
Okay.
you're correct, the trailer has been removed from the site.
Okay.
I don't, personally, the landscaping, I feel like is kind of out of our jurisdiction. My only comment or concern, because we did have erosion issues in the past that impacted the wetlands, would be just looking at the limits of the erosion control. And where I know that that's outside of our 100-foot buffer. But if we could just go back, the plan I have doesn't have it on there, but just Rebecca, where you were pointing out where the grade,
Here.
we're still seeing the map. Or
Oh
the,
my goodness. Okay.
where you were pointing out where the grade kind of channels around the detention basin.
Yes.
I would just be looking at that, honestly, because I don't really think that we can have any jurisdiction over what they're planting when it's not even in the buffer. So
Yeah.
I would just wonder if maybe we could bring that around a little more, just as they're getting into spring and it's going to be mucky and rainy. That would honestly be my only concern, because it did happen in the past. The only difference was that the basins were not stabilized at that point. And of course, a lot of the rainwater or the stormwater runoff is going to go into those basins that are established at this point. But if there was any chance for it, you can see kind of that channel around where the grading, goes down and then around the basin. I don't know if there's any potential erosion runoff going around the basin that way. It looks like it's going to direct to the pond. But I would just say maybe if we pulled that erosion control barrier up, I know we can't go onto the other person's property, but if we could pull it along that property line just a little bit, just to kind of protect ourselves if it does get really muddy in there during excavation.
Yep. I think that's reasonable.
Just so that we don't see anything happen. I don't know if it's realistic that we would get runoff from this site going all the way down to the wetland area now that everything has been established, but that's my only concern.
Makes some sense. Seth, would you be willing to run that erosion barrier like up along the property line?
Yeah, we'd be happy to add an extra 30 feet. That would be completely parallel with the lot line at that point, and be up into the house construction area. I really think that the potential is low, but I appreciate the concern. So we'd be happy to do that as whether it's a condition or if you'd like me to give you a revised plan, I'd be happy to do that as well.
And it looks like the way the grading is, I don't know scale wise, but it wouldn't even need to go that far. I'm just looking at kind of where it's, it's kind of like coming down. Even if you come up to the next contour line there, it's almost hitting the, what is it, 404? Is that right? If you just came up to that next contour so that you're catching just anything that's going to, that might be like 10 feet.
Yeah,
Not a lot. That's literally my only, I think that is kind of our only concern because of what we've seen in the past from this area.
It's 16 feet, so we'll be happy to do that.
Okay.
Just kind of protect everybody, protect the wetland, protect the construction crew.
Right. So I guess we could see what other members of the commission are thinking, but would it slow you down a lot, Seth, if we just tried to set up a site visit, get out there and vote on it at our next meeting? Because I don't think we have a lot of questions. Like I said, I just haven't been out there in a while. If other members don't think we need to go out there, I'm happy to have a vote tonight. But if you wouldn't mind waiting 2 weeks, I'd just like to get out and take a look.
If Mr. Given can address that, as he has hands-on with the construction schedule, so I wouldn't know the answer to that.
Ideally, we'd love to get an answer tonight. It could set us back a little bit by having to wait 2 weeks for that. So, but obviously, we'll respect whatever the, commission needs to do on that.
Other commission members have strong feelings?
I'd like to get out and take a look, Brian, if I could. I have not seen the site.
Okay. All right. So in that case, if possible, could we ask you to continue it for 2 weeks? I honestly think we should be able to approve it quickly next meeting. It's just kind of, like I said, going out and actually putting eyes on it, making sure we know what we're agreeing to. Would that be okay for you? And again, hopefully you can keep moving the process forward, knowing that we don't really foresee any major questions or issues.
So that means, when would the next meeting be?
It would be the 16th, I believe. Rebecca,
16th.
correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, that's correct.
So March 16th, so 2 weeks from tonight.
We'll make that work. We'll find a way
Okay.
to make that work.
All right. And we can, Rebecca, if you want to talk with either Seth or Peter, just to figure out when possibly we can get out there, I can be flexible on times and try to
Sure.
set something up this week or early next week or something.
Yep, I can send a follow-up email tomorrow to the commission, see your availability, and then I'll get in touch with Seth and Peter, and we can coordinate a time and date to get out there.
Okay.
I don't know if tomorrow's late notice, but I'll be out there late tomorrow afternoon.
What time's late tomorrow afternoon?
4:15, 4 o'clock, somewhere around there.
I'll let Rebecca put it out to people, but that would work for me.
Okay.
So I'll send an email after this meeting tonight so that they have it for tomorrow morning, and I'll see what their response is. But I mean, certainly commission members can go out if Peter's going to be there tomorrow. Just let me know that you've already been out, so then I can just coordinate with the rest of the commission members who haven't.
Okay. All right. So that said, I'd like to make a motion that we continue the public hearing for 19A Mill Pond Road until our next public meeting, Tuesday, March 16th at 7 o'clock p.m. Do I hear a second for that?
Second.
All right. All those in favor, we'll start with Emily,
Aye.
Bill,
Aye.
and Rebecca. I'm an aye as well.
Lori is also here now.
Lori Stevenson.
Aye.
All right. And Rebecca, I'm still an aye.
Okay, thank you. So I will be following up with you all tonight and then tomorrow morning as well.
Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
your
as
time.
well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. All right, Rebecca, are you ready for us to move on?
Yes, I was muted. I apologize.
Sorry. All right. The Bolton Conservation Commission will now continue a public hearing under Mass General Law, Chapter 131, Section 40, and under the Bolton Wetland Bylaw, Chapter 233, to discuss a notice of intent for Century Mill Road, Map 3.D, Parcel 75, proposed construction of 3 single-family homes and the widening and paving of an existing gravel driveway. All right. When we last left off, we were waiting to hear back from a peer reviewer regarding some areas that were questioned as to whether they were isolated land subject to flooding. And I know we have gotten those reports back. Rebecca, do you want to give us a quick update?
I would actually, so I have received the reports from both the applicant's engineer and our engineer who conducted the peer review. And I'd actually, with your permission, Mr. Chair, would like to hand it over to Dominic, our engineer, just to not only present his findings, but also express or address any questions the commission has. And then we can have the applicant weigh in if the commission wishes at that point.
That would be excellent. Dominic, if you are here and if you would like to give us a quick update on this.
I am
what you found, that would be
certainly,
fantastic.
certainly, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Dominic Rinaldi, with Senior Civil Engineer with the BSC Group. At the last public hearing a couple of weeks ago, what we talked about was our initial calculations on both depressions showed that there just wasn't enough volume to create the volume and depth of flooding required either under the act or the local bylaw. But the one question we did have was with regards to the soil types out there, in that, there was testing nearby, but on the other side of the houses. And if you look at the NRCS soils maps, there's a lot of different soil types nearby. So last Wednesday, Scott Hayes, the applicant's engineer, and I went out to the site. He had arranged to have a backhoe out there to perform a couple of test pits, one in each depression, to see what we would find. I would refer to you to Scott's letter from, I believe, Friday. That went out, I believe, Friday. I forget what the date of it is, but that has the specific details of the test pit results we found. Basically, what we found was in both depressions, almost the exact same thing. Relatively thin topsoil layer of sandy loamy sand underlain by immediately to a sea horizon of very gravelly, very stony, sandy material. And what we found was standing groundwater at roughly 20 to 22 inches in each hole, and evidence of seasonal high groundwater at about 12 inches deep. Yep, thank you. That's so we both observed them, both agreed on what the results were. So what these did was the soils matched up very well with the soils maps in terms of being a hydrologic soil group A, a soil that's going to drain well, which is what we had done our original calculations on. So just the one thing that sort of I don't know, I wanted a little more information on, I guess, was the fact that groundwater is obviously very high. I checked USGS groundwater information. Groundwater was considered at normal levels in the area last week, and you're talking about basically being 20 inches down in those two depressions. And seasonal highs, so you think spring and fall type time frames, it's about a foot down. So I did reach out to the circuit rider for the central region at DEP to see if that groundwater, that shallow groundwater, would dictate changing the calculations at all. So after some conversations, I provided the test pit information, pictures. She's actually familiar with the project. We talked in detail, and the general direction that we were given, which does match up well with sort of standard engineering practice, is to use the soil types that you actually find there, regardless of groundwater. And the soils are definitely in a soil. So therefore, the calculations that we had provided to you in a letter, I believe February 11th, don't change based on this information from DEP. And as such, neither depression really produces enough volume to meet the 1/4 acre foot of storage or the 6-inch average depth under the Act, or the 6-inch average depth of storage under the bylaw. But it is clear that what you're seeing out there is, water can't go into water. So what you're seeing out there when you're seeing this ponding is, the high groundwater, the foot plus of soil above that gets saturated, fairly quickly. It has nowhere to go, and everything else that comes in ponds up above it, and really probably holds there for a while, it wouldn't surprise me, because again, it has nowhere to go. There's no outlet from these depressions, until groundwater either recedes a little bit or this actually evaporates. It's sort of stuck there. And I think that's what you're seeing, regardless of whether or not it qualifies as jurisdictional areas. So I'd be happy to take any questions, any clarifications.
I have a question, or I just confirmation, I guess, with regard to your conversation with the circuit rider. So I know that DEP had questioned these depressions about a year ago. Did the circuit rider feel comfortable basically with the information in respect to their early comments? Did she feel comfortable with all of the data that we've collected thus far in determining that these are not isolated land subject to flooding?
She felt it best to sort of keep a neutral stance on actually making any definitive statements. And really what we talked about was providing guidance on whether or not the way we did the calculations, whether or not it was appropriate to change that A soil in the calcs to something else because of the high groundwater. And basically what we talked about is there really nowhere that they know of, that I know of, that anybody I work with know of, is there any sort of a guidance for runoff calculations in which you would make that change. Everything is very much based on, the soils that you actually find out there, or, if you didn't do this type of exploration, the best available info. But the best available info here is test pits that were done in the depressions themselves.
Did she feel like we needed any additional information?
No, because you don't need a ton of information to do these determinations. You really need some, you really need, effectively, my first letter, there's 3 pieces of information you need. You need, some topography, you need to know what's on the surface, and you need to know what the soils are.
Any other questions for Dominic right now from commission members?
So Dominic, if you have water that's a foot below the surface, right?
Right.
It does not affect the calculations at all, correct?
So correct. You do not change the calculations when it comes to, or you don't change what you find from the soils.
So what happens in just theoretically, I'm trying to understand this because the water is so close to the surface.
Right.
We do see ponding, and I'm trying to understand how we can see ponding and yet it seems okay, or it seems as if the ponding we see doesn't matter, right? So water, is we see it 12 inches right now. What if the water at certain points of the year is 3 inches above the ground surface? What does that mean? Or 6 inches above the ground surface?
So what you can do, so first of all, let me start by making the statement that based on what we saw in the field, and we saw, and you can see in the information you have in front of you here, we saw evidence of an estimated seasonal high groundwater at 12 inches. Generally, what that would mean is, yes, there are times when groundwater is below there, and there may be times when groundwater is above there, but it's fairly infrequent, or probably exceptionally infrequent, because it doesn't leave any evidence, right? As the groundwater goes up and down, it leaves evidence that it was there. It leaves mottling and other staining in the soils. We didn't see anything that led us to believe that there was any sort of regular occurrence of groundwater sort of higher than that 12-inch depth. It could happen. And if there was evidence that it happened regularly, you can use that groundwater in your ILSF calculations in terms of the volume. You still wouldn't change the runoff calculations, but if you knew there was 3 inches of standing water in that basin all the time or something, you would use that as part of the volume, but it would not change the runoff calculations. But again, there was nothing that we saw out there that would lead me to believe that that happens often enough that it's a regular condition. It certainly can happen. I guess the way I had to do a lot of thinking about this too, and sort of, sort of making the two things match up in my head. And I guess the way I kind of came to think about it after talking to DEP and some other folks and really thinking about what happens out here is whether or not it's jurisdictional, it's still ponds. Water, absolutely. I mean, there's picture, everybody knows, right? Water comes in there and floods and holds and stays there. The jurisdiction is based on a certain for the under the Wetlands Protection Act is based on a certain volume of water ponding to a certain average depth. It doesn't mean that you never see, it doesn't mean that water doesn't pond there. It doesn't mean that it doesn't even happen all the time. It just means that that volume to that depth doesn't show up in a calculation.
Yeah, I understand that, but we have pictures which shows us really close to the volume that we need, right? It's really close to the surface area that we need. What is it, 1/4 acre, I think is what it is.
It's a 1/4 acre foot of volume. So it's, what is that? It's about 1/4 foot. It's about 10,000 cubic feet plus or minus.
Yeah, I remember the picture we had was real close. I'm not sure if it was 10,000 or 1,000. It was close, whatever we saw, and that is what I keep questioning. I really don't understand it.
Well, and again, though, it's not area, it's volume, and it's to an average depth of 6 inches. So these are fairly big depressions. I want to say one of them is around 8,000 square feet at the bottom, and one of them is closer to 10.
I think they were 26 and 25,000 square feet.
Oh, they may even be that big. I forget off the top of my head. But so when you think about that, if, you'd still have to, if it's 20,000 square feet to get 10,000 cubic feet, you'd have to be an average depth of 6 inches deep across it just to get that volume. So just even if the water is covering the bottom of that basin, it still may not be enough water to qualify as isolated land subject to flood.
Okay, I hear that. I'm an electrical engineer. I'm not, a hydrologist or anything like that, groundwater specialist. Is there any way I can talk to you at some point one-on-one afterwards? Why don't you just teach me a little bit about your calculation? Because it's still confusing to me, that's all. I don't understand how the groundwater comes into your calculation or whether it's just ignored altogether.
I don't want to say it's ignored. For the sake of the calculation, the groundwater is not relevant. For the sake of what physically happens out there,
that's what I have a hard time with.
Certainly the groundwater is relevant.
I mean,
as I said, if the groundwater routinely was above the surface, then yeah, that would come into the calculation. Well, it would come into the volume calculation. But again, while that may happen,
right,
there's no evidence that it happens with any regularity.
That answer your question for now, Bill?
No, I still don't understand it. Is there any way I can talk to you one-on-one afterwards? I mean, is that legal, Rebecca? Can I even talk to him like this?
I would say your discussion should occur during a public meeting, just to be sure there's no.
I'm actually looking to understand the model more than anything. I mean, if
Yeah,
I can get online, find the model and try to.
Well, I mean, if I could tell you, as weird as this is, and I've told a lot of young engineers this, if you Google TR55, technical release TR55 of that's It's the hand calculated version of what we did. It's weirdly well written and fairly easy to understand. At least if you have, and I don't know, you said you're an electrical engineer. For me, I had some background by the time I read it as a civil engineer, but it's a pretty decent starting point. I would say it's publicly available. Put in TR-55.
What's the name of the model?
The actual program?
Yeah.
The actual program we use, there's a lot of different programs, by the way, that do this same math. The actual program we use is called Hydrocad. It's a company out of New Hampshire. It's far and away the most common one
Like a student
in this area. Yeah.
Okay, let me look into it. I just don't understand how we can see water so much of the year, right, during high water times anyways, and it not, yeah, I can see where we might not have the volume, the 10,000 square feet. I have to go back and look at that because I thought it was something smaller than 10,000 square feet. Okay.
Sorry, Bob. I have a couple more questions. Dominic, looking at this type A soil, what is the drainage like for type A soil?
It's water will run through type A soil faster than any other soil. So think sands, loamy sands, and that's I mean,
fine grains.
Yeah, well, it's not actually not fine grains, actually coarser grains, like a sand, or in the case of this is very stony, very gravelly.
Okay.
A lot of small gravel, a lot of like tennis ball-ish size stones and things in there.
So do you, I guess, in your professional opinion, do you think that the water that we are seeing at various times during the year could potentially be groundwater coming up because of the high water levels, or is that ponding due to runoff? Because based on the soil types, it seems like that area would drain quickly. So is what we're seeing more so of the high groundwater levels, and when we see higher groundwater levels basically coming up from below?
Yeah, what you're gonna get, as I said, there really wasn't any evidence that shows that groundwater is going above the surface of the ground. What you're gonna get is the runoff that comes in will go through that soil relatively quickly. The issue is that the groundwater itself is basically an impervious barrier, right? Water doesn't go into water.
Right.
And so even right now, as I said, you only have 20-ish inches of soil above actual groundwater in the middle of winter. And you generally you don't even have that full volume. You generally have about a third, 30% to 35% of that volume can actually be occupied by the runoff.
So there's nowhere,
because the rest of it is soil, right? So the water can just go in the spaces between the soil particles. So what's happening is stormwater comes in, it goes down, it'll go down pretty quickly, but it hits that groundwater and it has nowhere to go. So it builds up, it saturates the soil in the basin, and any more water that comes in just has nowhere to go. So it sits on the surface.
Got it.
And again, because there's no outlet to this, it's not a detention basin or something like that with an outlet. It basically just has to sit there, and what's either going to have to happen is groundwater recedes or things evaporate, which is why I'm guessing you probably see water sitting there for an extended period.
So I guess my next question, and you might not have the answer to this, if we put a septic system like a leaching field on top of something like that, how far above the water table does that leaching field have to be?
Well, so that falls under
That's not you.
Title V regulations, and there is I honestly, I don't do a lot of septic systems, so bear with me. And Scott may have to. So there's a required separation of groundwater from the bottom of a septic system, a leaching field, and for faster soils, I believe that you potentially have to go more. But that's as long as you have that, then you can build a septic system above it. But again, that falls under Title V, and
Right.
the Board of Health will obviously check that. So and what you're seeing here, and one other thing to note is if you look at the test pits they did for septic out front, where the ground is a lot higher, and the test pits we just did in the depressions, you're seeing groundwater at almost the exact same place, right? Both standing and seasonal high, which generally makes sense. So that sort of similarity also plays into feeling comfortable with what's out there.
So would it be safe then to say, and to sort of summarize is, and maybe Scott can weigh in too, but so within the two depressions, so both being independent of each other, both of these have areas of water that emerge to the surface, correct? So they're two separate areas. The water's emerging through the surface from the water being the groundwater.
Well, I don't know if
And that's-
groundwater is coming above the surface. There's not anything that made me think that, certainly not now. And like I said, the estimated seasonal high that we both saw was about a foot deep, which means that, yes, it's possible at some point, right? Anything is statistically possible when you get down to it. So at some point, yes, I'm sure groundwater has popped up above the ground, but it doesn't happen with enough frequency to leave any evidence that it's occurring. So it's not a regularly occurring, or even, So I wouldn't say that groundwater is coming up above the surface as much as stormwater runoff is coming in, saturating that ground, that little bit of soil that you have above the groundwater, and then it has nowhere to go. So anything that comes in after that, just going to sit on the ground.
Gotcha.
You were saying a foot of stormwater would take what, 3 feet of soil, that type of soil, to be saturated?
Well, so generally,
you would need a height of 3 feet to still keep the water off the surface, right? So if we had
no. So what I was saying was, right. So in
30%,
in soil, right, you have the soil particles, and in between them you have, if they're dry, you have empty space. That's where the water goes. And generally speaking, a commonly accepted void ratios are 30 to 40% of the space is available for storage. So what I was saying is, in that foot of, if the groundwater is at its seasonal high, in that foot of soil, you don't actually have the full volume to store stormwater.
right?
So that's what I'm saying is, it fills up quicker than, you don't need that much stormwater to fill that up before the soil is saturated and everything else sits on the ground.
Rebecca, well, I was going to ask quickly, Dominic, too, just within the area we looked at there, if we were to see 3 foundations, 3 new driveways, all of that, would it be fair to say that the ponding in the area between the houses and between the neighbors will be greater ponding, more frequent, just because you're making more of that space impervious? And we know it ponds because of high seasonal, well, we assume it's high seasonal groundwaters because they're not isolated land subject to flooding.
I mean, it depends. I don't know where the stormwater is being directed. That wasn't something we were tested with. So, if you increase the stormwater, yeah, right? I mean, the more volume you have, the more ponding you have.
I was trying to look at the stormwater runoff, and it doesn't.
Yeah.
And again, we will have to look back at the plans too, but it just looked like everything was basically just getting set into the ground, basically away from the house into the ground that surround it, which we know already flood and pond. I was just, there's no way to really calculate, will that happen more often? Will it be more severe? I mean, I don't see where that, definitely doesn't run off the back end of the property. There's a huge berm there. Everything seems to just sit and saturate in that general area.
Could we pull up a plan just to look at? And I know we had the storage right at the south end of the property, and then Scott had proposed a secondary compensatory storage.
I think those are them, right. I was trying to see with the amount that the septics, the 3 different septics, were going to be. It sounds like with a high groundwater, those are going to be need to be mounded, and possibly mounded significantly. I could be wrong. So it looks like we're going to have a bunch of mounds and a bunch of houses that all drain straight down into their yards, which is the whole area that currently ponds and floods. And it's just, we're just making more impervious space in an extremely wet area that just catches and holds a lot of water as it slowly drains out. I'm just not seeing where any of that water goes other than sitting on the ground and ponding. But I mean, it's just a quick look at it.
Yeah, did we, and I apologize for asking this, but did we see stormwater calcs for this?
Are you talking about the whole property itself?
Have we seen just like a whole stormwater analysis?
Scott, was that submitted with your application? I can't recall off the top of my head, so I do apologize.
Yes.
Okay.
It was.
Okay.
Thank you.
I thought we had a few months ago, right?
I think so.
Okay.
Would this is Matt Watsky. Would the
Go ahead,
chair
Matt.
like Scott Hayes to address the question where one of the members was speculating that the septic systems would be mounded systems and there'd be a problem? Would you like the engineer who designed them to explain it again?
Sure. I'd love to if he's willing to.
Sure.
Yeah. So the areas tested on lots 2 and 4, they were consistent with the soils we found in the depressions themselves as well. They're much higher in elevation. They're probably about 4 to 6 feet higher in elevation, and we had estimated seasonal high water in those system areas about 4 feet. And for the fast permeable soil, less than 2 minutes per inch, as they call it in the code, requires a 5-foot groundwater offset. So those septic systems bottom are 5 feet above the estimated seasonal high water level and filled in and around to the front of the houses. But it doesn't result in more than a 2 to 3 foot grade change in the areas of the septic systems themselves, because we're not building them in the middle of these depressions. They're up gradient, so we've got more depth to water table to overcome that, but they are mounted slightly. And with respect to the ponding and the depressions, I mean, based on the evidence of what we found on the soil tests, I mean, there's no evidence that the estimated seasonal high water breaches the surface of the ground in there. And there are areas of water, obviously that have been observed ponding, and I believe that has to do with just the seasonal frost conditions of the topsoil being frozen and acting as an temporarily impervious layer where water, snow melt, and rain just falls.
We have pictures of November 30th, December 1st, prior to freezing, where it shows that ponding in that one area where the cursor is right now. So it's not just freezing. It's not because of frost.
Yeah, maybe it's not just freezing, but I think it's a contributing factor. And then just the nature of topsoil being
not all year. So I don't think you can say that and get away with that one.
I'm sorry, sir.
I'm not sure you can say, you can make that comment in
Well, I think I don't think I'm trying to get away with anything. I'm trying to understand what's happening out there as you are. I think that contributes to this. I think the finer nature of the topsoil, temporarily just sort of ponds water in certain areas where the topsoil is thicker than in other areas. So in the test holes that we dug, we had 4 inches of topsoil in one. I think we had 12 inches in another. So the topsoil thickness varies. So that can be a contributing factor into why it pools in some areas, as well as just the general topography being slightly lower here and there. So I just wanted to point out that there was no evidence that groundwater penetrated the surface and it all contributed to the ponding in these areas. Just rainfall and snow melt. So.
Could you comment what's being proposed to mitigate that rainfall and snow melt? Again, we're getting the ponding there now without foundations and driveways and all of this. We're going to be adding foundations and driveways and everything. Where does that water go? Is this going to make ponding worse in this area? Because you said it yourself, you're trying to understand, we're trying to understand, where does this ponding come from? What's causing it? And is this construction going to make it significantly worse? And if you don't think it is, then why don't you think it is? And if you do think it is, what are you doing to mitigate it?
So before Scott, before you answer, it's just not clear to me who is asking the question.
I'm asking that question.
I can't see who's asking the question, so I don't know who's asking the question. And I want to know does the chair want Mr. Hayes to respond?
Sure, I'm actually asking that question. I am the chair. I'm asking that question. Okay. Is my name not up on the screen, Mr. Watsky? It should be with the Zoom.
With the way the plan is displayed, with you speaking, I can't see you right now. That's the only problem. I can't see who is speaking.
I was going to say you might want to try to change your settings.
There we go. No, I just changed. I just scrolled through, and now I can see Mr. Berube and
perfect.
Mr. Garrity. All right.
So I was the one who was actually posing the question.
Very good.
So if he could go ahead and answer, feels comfortable answering, I'd love to hear what he has to say.
Be glad to have him do that. Go ahead, Scott.
Thank you. Yeah. So, really, we've been evaluating these areas very aggressively and with respect to determining jurisdiction and trying to quantify that through calculations and field observations, et cetera. We just haven't been able to correlate or create the kind of volume necessary based on the calculations and observations we've made to support that these areas are jurisdictional. Construction of a dwelling, really, the contributing area of the house in lot 2, it's about the rear half of the house. The driveway and the front part of the house really draining toward the common driveway in a way. It's just, these areas, they're isolated and they have excessive available storage volume. So if the drainage patterns were to change and the areas did pool more, they're not going anywhere beyond the 309, the 3010 contour. So I think the big question though is are these jurisdictional under the act or the bylaw? And that's what we're trying to ascertain here. And then if they are, what do we need to do to mitigate alteration of them? If they're not, do we need to mitigate alteration of them at all? So.
Right, but we're actually discussing the full OOC for this, right? We're discussing the full plan, and this, without a doubt, a part of it are these resource areas or not, but fictional to us. There's definitely work going within resource areas, buffer areas. You're in stream front. I mean, it's an extremely jurisdictional project. the question is, were those lands isolating land subject to flooding and thus increasing the jurisdiction of certain areas? But most of this project is definitely jurisdictional. Most of this is being done within buffer zone and resource areas.
Well, so why don't I try to rephrase the question to Scott
Sure.
and see if we can focus in. So Scott, I think you and the peer reviewer have each independently reached the conclusion that these isolated areas are not jurisdictional under either the act or the bylaw, but you do have a plan that shows compensatory flood storage to mitigate the effect to the extent that it's even jurisdictional. I think that the applicant could choose to remove those mitigation areas from the plan altogether, but his direction to me was to leave them in if the board wants them. So I'd ask Scott Hayes to go ahead and sort of walk the commission through the thought process for where the compensatory flood storage is proposed. What kind of volume have you provided? Why is it where you're proposing it? Because the work on the site is just buffer zone. Given that the isolated areas are non-jurisdictional. So why did you put those compensatory flood storage areas where you did?
Well, before we got into the peer review on the volume calculations and the depressions, we took a conservative approach of evaluating the depression areas to using the base flood elevation of the adjacent floodway of elevation 310, just presuming that all volume within the isolated depressions A and B that's below elevation 310 is being altered, proposed to be altered. We had proposed those mitigation areas on lot 4 and lot 3, basically as compensatory flood storage areas that exceed the volume that is proposed to be filled by the activities on lots 2 and 4. But I mean, that's really going back a few pages in the process here. And we're still showing those mitigation areas, but even in light of lack of supporting evidence of the jurisdiction of the depressions. And I wasn't contending at all the commission's jurisdiction over the site. Clearly there's riverfront, there's floodplain, there's buffer zone, there's a lot of resource areas on the site, and there's work within primarily within the buffer zones to those areas, but clearly this is a jurisdictional site. My specific statement was related to the depressions and our evaluation of those areas. So,
Mr. Chairman, if I may just provide some clarification on your statement in question previously.
Please, yeah, I have a point afterwards, but please go ahead.
Sure. So I would like to remind all those present that actually under our wetland bylaw for the town of Bolton, chapter 233, that the area 25 feet from the bordering vegetated wetlands is a prohibition area, basically, where it's no disturb area.
Thank you.
The remaining 75 feet that makes up the 100-foot buffer under the Wetlands Protection Act, under our bylaw, though, that remaining 75 feet is an adjacent upland resource area in itself. And I believe what Mr. Chairman was trying to establish is that you have shown compensatory flood storage regarding those areas that we have or had in question regarding lot 2 and lot 4. However, you're proposing these areas within jurisdictional areas still, and therefore how are you going to be mitigating that on site as required under our performance standards? And that's, I believe, what, and Mr. Chair, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what you were inquiring.
You were, and that's kind of the point I wanted. That's kind of what I was trying to get around to, was the compensatory flood storage. Rather than cutting up buffer zone, why don't we use the place we already know floods and ponds as compensatory storage? Mr. Watsky, I appreciate you make the comment. It's just buffer zone, but it's not a comment that flies really well with this commission. Buffer zone's important. Buffer zone's protected. Buffer zone's important with climate change. You may not believe the science, doesn't mean it's not real. It's not just buffer zone, it's important. And I see us doing a lot of cutting up the buffer zone to provide for flooding that's already being provided for in the huge, basically it's a pond that's not being called a pond, sitting there already. And I don't understand why we'd cut up buffer zone and fill in the existing ponding area. Why don't we just leave that as ponding area, leave the buffer zone alone, and just pull your project to the front? I mean, maybe it's just 2 houses instead of 3, but why aren't we just using the existing flooding ponding area as flood storage rather than cutting up buffer zone, which we're not supposed to be touching? We're supposed to be mitigating if we cut it up, and you're cutting it up for flood storage to mitigate for other buffer zone infractions. It seems ridiculous. Is there a reason we can't just use the existing floodplain as floodplain?
I'd be glad to answer your question.
Please.
All right. So, and Scott Hayes can weigh in on the technical side of this when I'm done, if he wishes. But the areas where he's proposed the compensatory flood storage are areas where it's directly adjacent to existing bordering lands subject to flooding. And under DEP's rules and guidance, if you're going to provide compensatory flood storage, it's expected that it is actually directly touching an existing bordering land subject to flooding. And so he designed it to meet that standard. It's not, however, compensatory flood storage that's proposed in order to comply with that rule, or any rule that's mandatory under your local bylaw, because the areas that the houses are proposed in have been established as non-jurisdictional. So there's no requirement in your bylaw or in DEP's rules to provide compensatory flood storage. We proposed it as something that said it's quote the belt and suspenders. It's providing something extra. If the commission's uncomfortable with having those areas graded to provide additional volume, we're happy to take them off of the plan, or frankly, to have you go ahead. This is what I think should happen, is to close the hearing, vote to approve the project, because the areas that you've been so focused on have been determined by your peer reviewer and our engineer as non-jurisdictional. So the project should be allowed to proceed. And if the commission doesn't want, I'll finish. If the
Please,
commission doesn't want those, the bordering vegetated, the compensatory flood storage areas to get built, you vote not to have them built, and we submit a revised plan as a condition of the approval to remove them from the plan.
Well, submitting a revised plan is fine. It's one thing. Again, you seem to have proven by the letter of the law that we can't call those isolated lands subject to flooding, even though mysteries and questions remain. And in reality, they may be. There are still questions not answered, but it seems like we can't qualify it as such. That's fine. There's still a ton of buffer zone work, The entire driveway almost, right? Coming off the riverfront or the stream front. All that needs to be mitigated for. There are 3 rules. We have avoid, keep it out of the buffer zone, which you've done in some cases, but you're still in it. Minimize, and I can understand you said you've tried to shrink parts of the project, and then mitigate. And that's what that flood storage is for. And you keep saying we can keep it or we can get rid of it. It's up to you to propose mitigation. And what I'm saying is tearing up some of the buffer zone to make extra flood storage, to me, is not appropriate mitigation. It doesn't really mitigate what's happening here. So what I'm saying is, I don't think we need to close it. I think we need to see a plan with appropriate mitigation. If those were considered a land subject to flooding, oh, cool. You could have had your flood storage there, and we could have asked for a plan around that. Now you're saying, no, it's not. It's totally not land subject to flooding. Okay, well, we got to find that mitigation somewhere else, because I don't think anybody's arguing this is a ridiculously wet area that holds a ton of water and groundwater all over the place. So I guess that's what I'm looking for. Is I'd like to see a new plan with mitigation that does not necessarily tear up buffer zone. And if not mitigation, then minimization and just avoidance. Get stuff out of that buffer zone.
Brian,
And that's just what I'm asking for. I'll let other members have their questions, but I would like to see a revised plan with appropriate mitigation proposed.
Mr. Berube, could you
Go ahead, please.
clarify for me at least, mitigation for what?
Buffer zone, any infractions into the buffer zone, the 75-foot buffer zone? I mean, what are we doing? We're taking up a lot of ground that normally holds a ton of water, and I don't see how we're dealing with any of the new water that's coming in, any of the ponding and flooding, anything to do with groundwater supplies. I'm just not sure. I mean, this whole plan, I just don't understand why this fits with the Wetland Protection Act at all.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just provide another clarification.
Please.
You're referring to the buffer zone under the Wetlands Protection Act, but you're also referring to the adjacent upland resource area under our bylaw. Again, that is its own protected resource area, the remaining 75 feet after the 25-foot prohibition area from the wetlands resource area. And within our bylaw, which is available online, you will find there are performance standards and presumptions that need to be overcome. So although I do appreciate Mr. Watsky's note about the DEP's requirement for compensatory flood storage under certain parameters, currently this plan proposes it within a resource area under a bylaw. Therefore, what Mr. Chairman is asking for and referring to is, well, now you're mitigating for one thing, but you're actually encroaching on another. And in fact, that's what I believe he is asking for mitigation, and therefore pointing out these depressional areas that may, to the applicant's benefit, provide that aspect of mitigation. Or the commission may find that it isn't being mitigated appropriately on site, and it sounds like they're asking for an updated plan to show those mitigation areas and how you're proposing to do it, because I do appreciate that there has been some thought put in regarding the Wetlands Protection Act, but under the bylaw resource area, solely based on the adjacent upland resource area, not even looking at the other that are solely based on our wetlands bylaw, chapter 233, there's a concern there. That's still the commission's jurisdiction. It's more restrictive than the Wetlands Protection Act as it's allowed to be, and that needs to be considered in this plan. And I believe that's what the chair is referring to.
Yes,
I understand all that. And as we've said before, the two areas for compensatory flood storage were provided without any sense that there was a regulatory requirement to do so, but was an extra added in to try to allay the commission's concerns about filling the areas that we believe, have believed all along, are non-jurisdictional, and your peer reviewer agrees. So there is no regulatory requirement to compensate for filling the areas that are non-jurisdictional. The concerns that have been expressed about the long driveway that's partially within riverfront area, you have an existing driveway, and what's been presented is a redesign of it and an enhancement of it that actually improves its function and improves the conditions as compared to the existing condition within that riverfront area. It provides stormwater management where none exists now. And the houses are located where they appropriately should be located, set off further from any vegetated wetland boundary. So we think it's a plan that does do exactly what your bylaw is calling for, which is to be conscientious to protect resource areas, including, I understand what you consider the resource area to be the buffer zone is a resource area. We get that. And yeah, there's a good bit of work proposed on the existing driveway, but it's been designed, as Scott Hayes has previously testified, to improve the conditions as compared to the existing condition. If the commission prefers, and I'm hearing you loud and clear, you're not fans of the two areas. I wish that I could take control of the cursor and show them in, but the grayed in areas where Scott Hayes, no, not that area and the one to the right of it on lot 3. you're not fans of those areas, which were proposed as just to provide additional compensatory flood storage, that there's no regulatory trigger for it. We can take
Sure.
those out.
Well,
We're happy to remove those.
What I'm saying is I'd like to see what you're proposing for mitigation. I'm not sure, does this plan take into effect the photos that we saw and the flooding and the ponding that we saw? A lot of those areas, the compensatory flood planning, they already flood. Again, they already flood on a regular basis. So I don't know what that's proposing is. And I'd have to read through the plans again. Is it just digging that another foot down, just going in and just ripping out the vegetation, digging in another foot down and letting it revegetate? Because it already floods. Both of those areas already get flooding. So I don't really see how that mitigation, and again, my fear, Mr. Watsky, partially is the neighbors. Like what's going to stop their yards from flooding? Because the flooding storage that you have proposed, it already floods. They have pictures of it. So where's that water going? And my guess is you're flooding out their yards. That's one of the big fears, and that's why we're asking for these questions of mitigation. People live out there, and I think you're going to cause problems for them. It really seems it with the water that we've seen there and how it's reacted so far in the last few years when we've looked at this project. Yeah, so that's what I'm asking for. I'm saying if you want me to close the hearing tonight, we can close the hearing tonight, but I don't feel like I can vote on it tonight until I get that. I need to see a mitigation plan that actually fits in with the new information we have. You've been provided with pictures, you've been shown where it floods. And you've heard me say that. I don't like you just digging up buffer zone and saying, well, that's just flood storage. Is there another way we can mitigate this project?
To help me
Minimize
understand
this project, or just avoid the buffer zones altogether?
Mr. Chairman, to your point, if you were to close this evening, you would not be able to accept any new information. So the commission would have to only be considering what they currently have on file and what's currently been submitted as of tonight if it were to close. So just to note, even though you're clearly stating that, and I think, and you can see if the rest of the commission is under the same impression, needing to see that mitigation, it may be beneficial to in fact provide that plan, because if the applicant were to refuse a continuation or to ask the commission to close, they have to go by what's been submitted thus far. And I do want to just highlight here that yes, the commission has been really focused on these isolated areas, because during those were our biggest outlying questions that the commission kept requesting information for, and it was never received. So now during this hearing process, yes, the commission is very happy that applicants been willing to work with them on the review process, but we haven't gone further than that to review the site because we've been talking about these areas. And now, as you can tell, the chairman at the very least, and we'll hear from the other commission members, is asking for and to show these mitigation areas that are within their jurisdiction and that are mitigating resource areas under the local bylaw. And they appreciate the planning and the thought process that's gone into this, but clearly they're asking for a little bit more information that's going to help them make an accurate and well-informed decision for this project. And I would hate to see that not occur if they're lacking information.
Understood. What I'm hoping for, Rebecca, is for me to be able to better understand what Mr. Berube is looking for us to mitigate. It's still, honestly, it's not clear to me what we're supposed to mitigate. I understand he's concerned about work within buffer zone. The proposed driveway, which is a modification of the existing driveway, I think has already been well designed. Is his concern about what happens when you put a house and fill material into the non-jurisdictional isolated wetland areas?
I believe that's a portion of it regarding just concerns for where that water will go, and if stormwater calculations prove that in fact it's being infiltrated on site and there's ways to accommodate that, I don't know, maybe that's the solution. The commission would be comfortable with it. They haven't stated that, but what is clear to me is when I look on site, yes, I appreciate the amount of work associated with that driveway, but that's not maintaining a driveway. That's not infrastructure within the exact same footprint. That's a significant increase as far as the infrastructure and the disturbance goes within that area. So there's a concern there. They're looking at the amount of tree removal within the buffer or the adjacent upland resource area. So everything within the buffer on this site that is a permanent structure is something that needs to be mitigated. So even the wells, the well placement I'm seeing, there's fencing that's to assist people, as I understand it, to stay out of the resource area, but you have a significant amount of grading and potential landscaping that's going to change that area. So it's really the permanent infrastructure, the expansiveness of the infrastructure there within jurisdictional areas to the Conservation Commission that needs to be mitigated. But again, the commission, that's what they're reviewing, because if you review our bylaw, under the adjacent upland resource area, the performance standards allow for temporary and limited if the commission feels that it does not impact the resource area, not a permanent structure. So that's something that the commission has to weigh in a particular circumstance where there's not mitigation proposed, or maybe the applicant isn't willing to show the mitigation on site. So I believe that's what Mr. Chairman's trying to relay. And yes, obviously the concern is those isolated areas as well, but if they're not in fact jurisdictional, then, but what he's highlighting those areas for is maybe the applicant, it's to their benefit to use those as that mitigation area to offset what they're proposing within the adjacent resource area. So in summary, there is significant alterations proposed on this plan within the adjacent upland resource area and under our bylaw and in the buffer area under the Wetlands Protection Act. Under our bylaw, those all need to be mitigated. And if mitigation is not proposed, then the commission's going to have difficulty just under looking at our bylaw language to really be able to weigh out if it's appropriate for the site or not.
Okay, well, I think we've taken this as far as we can take it tonight. I'll agree to continue the hearing. So, and Scott Hayes has to leave because he's got another hearing that he needs to go to, and I'm sure that the commission's got other things it needs to deal with on its agenda. So I'll agree to continue this. I'll take the commission's guidance that you've given me tonight back to the client and discuss it with Scott Hayes, and we'll see what we can do. Honestly, I'm still really not clear on what mitigation the commissioners are thinking is necessary or appropriate, but we'll hash it out among the project team and try to come back to you.
Appreciate that.
Can I talk, Brian?
Sorry. Go ahead, Emily, if you have.
Wanting to say a few things. I agree with the comment about the compensatory flood storage needs to not be in the buffer zone. And I personally would like to go back and look at the stormwater calcs. I did look at them briefly when they were submitted. But again, as you mentioned before, we have been so focused on these two depression areas for months, actually for over a year, but they just finally have been addressed. That I would really like to go back and look at the stormwater calcs prior to our next meeting. With regard to the driveway, and I brought this up in a meeting months ago to Scott Goddard when he was present. I had asked for the trees to be, I think Scott had said that no trees would be removed. And when we went out on site and saw where the driveway was staked, there are many mature trees that need to be removed to improve the driveway. So, and I think I had asked at that time that those trees be identified either in the field or on a plan. But because they are in our jurisdiction and they are mature trees, we at least should receive that information, and that was never provided to us.
Okay, is that not information that's shown on this plan with the what looks like trees being X'd out that shows?
It is. Yep.
Okay, so that was updated on the plans.
This was the plans that were updated after the calculations.
Okay.
After December or January. I'd have to look at when Scott Hayes sent the letter, but
so although from a drainage standpoint and from a I guess material improvement for this driveway, I do not see the removal of mature trees as an improvement to, you know, the overall site. So I understand that this driveway is being considered as an improvement by the design team and by the applicant. But when we look at it and we see that all these mature trees are being removed within the buffer, that to us is not an improvement. That is an impact to the climate and the natural resources. So I just want to make that point, because I don't see the driveway being an improvement the same way that was implied earlier when we have so many mature trees being removed to make it a different material and to widen it, especially since we are close to the wetland in that area.
Rebecca, can I ask, is there anybody here from the public to comment on this evening before we continue?
Yep, Jim Garrity is here.
Hi. Question, it comes back to Dom again on the model. So I believe you said that if the CN curves were in the high 80s, or in other words, de-soil, right, then those isolated lands would be subject to flooding, correct?
I think so. We ran them as a sort of test run. I don't have it in front of me because it wasn't an official thing, but I think they may have. I don't know exactly where the line was.
It's at 87. I downloaded the software and I ran it. So it's 87. So the problem I have is you went and did soil samples and you had, you concluded that it was a soil. My question is, how do we know that it's a soil when both of those depressions were dug up with a bulldozer 2 years ago? The soil is gone. Of course, it's sandy soil because it was dug up. We have pictures of that. There's no way you can conclude what that soil was 2 years ago.
So I can't.
If I may, Mr. Chairman. Scott,
go ahead. I'm going to ask Mr. Waskey if you have a quick comment, and then we'll see if Dominic can go ahead and answer.
So first, Scott Hayes isn't here anymore, and so we're not really in a position to deal with the technical aspects, but and so this has gone on longer than he had available for this. This is the kind of question that he should really respond to. But as I understand it, there's a well-defined topsoil on the site and a well-defined B soil, and then there's the C layer underneath. So I know that the people are arguing that there was work that was done up there, but it didn't scrape everything away because all of the topsoil is still there, and even the vernal pool assessment that was done by the Conservation Commission's peer reviewer found organic soils that were there, and it had vegetation that was established, and so the whole area has not been scraped clear with all of the topsoil removed. So that's just not factually accurate given the technical reports that have been provided to the commission in this case.
I don't agree with that. I fundamentally disagree. A bulldozer was in there for over a week. There's pictures. You can't deny the facts and the photos. He dug up, I don't know how many feet was dug up in those areas.
They removed debris that had been buried on the site. They didn't scrape away and remove soils.
I would
If
suggest
you
that you
could
go
just
back and look at the
direct your
picture.
questions and comments through the
Yes.
chair so that we just
Very good
maintain
idea. Everything should go.
order, that would be excellent. I do appreciate your concerns, Jim, and I do understand that we do have the images. There was excavation work done. I would just simply ask Dominic to talk about the soils that they did see on site, just briefly in summary. And then it sounds like and again, this is up to the chair, but it sounds like it will be continued. So there may be an opportunity for Scott Hayes to address this at the next meeting, potentially.
Sure. So I certainly can't speak to what happened in
Yeah.
2 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever it was. However, I can say so. Both Scott Hayes and I have taken the state's soil evaluation courses, and I routinely I'm not even going to venture a guess how many soil test pits I've observed over the course of my career. So there is sort of a methodology and a general basis for identifying fill versus naturally occurring materials. What I can tell you, in the 2 test pits and the spots that we dug, there was topsoil, and the underlying sandy, like I said, really gravelly, stony, sandy material does not appear to be fill. I can't, like I said, I can't speak to what was disturbed years ago and how it was put back, but the material that is there now is like I said, it's not a fill material.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Does
Dominic.
that answer a little bit of what you were looking for, Jim?
Yeah, no, appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Other public comment sign, as Rebecca said, this will be continued. So if there's something that you'd rather ask Scott, please let us know.
Rebecca.
Richard Davis is present as well.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Richard,
Sorry.
do you have a question?
I have quite a few. These are directed to Dominic.
Richard, just
Directed-
again, just to be clear about the public meeting process, you do have to direct your questions to or through the chair, considering
Okay.
Dominic is our peer reviewer hired by the Conservation Commission, and therefore, if the chair feels it appropriate, he can share or ask the peer reviewer to address them.
I understand. Brian,
Yes.
Dominic talked about the idea that water is in these depressed areas is not being a regular condition. I'm curious if he could define what a regular condition means. Like, if there's water in there 2 weeks a year, is that a regular condition? If it's 6 months a year, is that a regular condition? I'd like to have some number, some sort of bracketed parameter on what that means as a regular condition.
Dominic, do you understand that question, or is there
I
general-
think so. And I'd like to clarify something, and I apologize if I didn't make this clear. What I'm saying is not whether or not water is in there. I don't know how often water ponds in that, and it probably varies from year to year. What I was saying is there's no evidence that groundwater rises up above the ground surface with regularity. What is regularity? There is no definition. Under the guidelines for doing these types of soil test pits, you look for certain evidence that demonstrates where groundwater gets to frequently enough that it leaves a mark. right? So it leaves discoloration in the soil. They call them soil modeling or redoxamorphic features. And they're discolorations as the groundwater goes up and down. It pulls minerals out of the soil and changes the colors. And when you have enough of that, that's when you can define it. At this point, it happens often enough that it's defined as seasonal high groundwater elevation. That doesn't mean it's always there. It doesn't mean it doesn't go higher than that. It just means that is seasonal high groundwater. And that is what is used for stormwater calculations. That's what's used for septic system design. So what regularity is, I don't know. You'd have to get into some probably real deep soil science to tell you how often groundwater has to hit a certain point to leave evidence that it goes there. So like I said, I mean, everything is statistically possible. It can happen, but it doesn't happen enough that seasonal high groundwater is that we estimated, and I agreed with Scott, and I both agreed that at about 12 inches down in each of these two test pits, each of these two depressions.
Right. Does that kind of answer what you were looking for, Richard?
I think he kind of went around it. In his discussion earlier, he talked about this area not being routinely a flooded condition. So what was the point of that?
I don't know that I said it would routinely flood. I don't know how often it floods. Again, what we were tasked with is doing a determination based upon the regulatory guidance for whether or not this area qualifies as isolated land subject to flooding, and the really long sort of equivalent version that the bylaw defines. It floods. That's not the point. And that's why I was saying is it took me a while to come around to sort of melding these two ideas in my head, that it can flood and not be jurisdictional. So again, I don't know how often it floods. And
Thank you, Dominic.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Dominic.
Any additional questions, Richard or
Yes,
Rebecca? Is there anybody else?
I have quite a few, and they're kind of technical. And I don't know. Well, I'll just go. You'll cut me off when it's time.
Go ahead. Why don't you start with I just have to be careful of time this evening.
I understand.
But go ahead.
Why did we have Dominic do this test? Go out and do these test pits. And my understanding is that our last meeting, he did a theoretical calculation that said in a 100-year storm event, the maximum amount of water that would ever accumulate above the surface of the soil was 1/2 an inch. Now that hasn't even been discussed in this meeting tonight. We're talking about, groundwater the whole evening, rather than talking about the water that's above the soil surface. And back to Bill's, questions earlier, we were talking about 1,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet, of water. So why aren't we talking about the water tonight? Why are we talking about the groundwater? I understand the groundwater. You can't push water into water. So when we get rain, and a lot of rain, it's going to float on top. It's going to add. It's going to sit on top of the existing groundwater level.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I can just comment. So, Richard, you, in a way, on our peer reviewers' recommendation, test pits are the best way to establish what soil type is exactly there, which is one of the 3 items that he has already listed out multiple times that are taken into consideration, that are required under the regulatory standard, I'll call it, and how you establish whether or not those areas are jurisdictional. So at the last meeting, we talked about why is it not matching on site? What we're getting from what he was getting from the calculation, the applicant's engineer. So they went out, did the test pits. The only difference was, so they confirmed the soil type, but what they also saw was that there's relatively high groundwater. So therefore, water can't go into water, so it sits on top. However, that does not change the way the calculations are run, because under the directions, to be general about it, in the regulations of how you establish those jurisdictions, you use those three things as Dominic already established. So the soil type was shown in the field. They confirmed that. They ran it again with that soil type because that was what was confirmed. And therefore, that's what they got from the calculations. And thus, under DEP standard and under the calculations that they ran for the bylaw, those are the conclusions that they got. So the reason why we were talking about the groundwater was because that was the outlier for why the soils, or why on site it was functioning in that way.
Okay. But if we had a type C or a less pervious, impervious soil there, we'd have, I mean.
Then if there was a different soil type there when they dug the test pits, then they would have run the calculations with that soil type. Yes.
And do they run the calculations after these test pits were done, accounting for the high water table? That's part of the calculation? Did the calculation change from the?
No, may I answer that, Mr. Chairman? So no, the calculation didn't change. And what I was explaining at the beginning is that was sort of the discussion. That was sort of nothing. That was exactly the discussion I had with DEP was, do you change these calculations for ILSF based on the high groundwater? And the direction I was given from DEP was, no, you do the calculation based on the soil type. And the soil type is a type A, which means the calculations that I did originally didn't change at all.
So Rebecca, I don't quite understand that, because we're talking about this area to pool water.
Yes.
Well, if you have a high water table, it's going to pool more water because there's no place for the water to go. And for that not to be considered in some kind of model of this, does that make sense to you?
So unfortunately, sometimes the regulations do not cover every single situation and circumstance that you come across. So in our bylaw, there is a little bit of not ambiguity, but some consideration to account for areas that aren't textbook. But at the end of the day, the soil type is still a soil type A, so you would still run it that way. And I completely understand what Dominic is referring to with the calculations that were carried out and why. Because under the regulatory standards that were given, or regulatory requirements, you have to follow it a certain way. And it doesn't say if it is a high water, if it had that consideration in it, then Dominic would have considered that and included that within the calculations. So what we have to go by is, what the commission's jurisdiction is the wetland bylaw under chapter 233 and the Wetlands Protection Act. And in both of those, it does not explicitly state you need to accommodate the high groundwater. You're still doing the same calculation.
Well, thank you for that clarification. High water doesn't seem to be such an extenuating circumstance to me. So I hope when the time comes that you're using the interpretation within the guidelines, the bylaws, that you take serious consideration of that, because something still doesn't, quite tally. We know that last week we talked about, we can't forget this. the 7-inch rain, the 100-year flood event, the maximum amount of water that's in there should be a half an inch. And there's a heck of a lot more than a half of an inch of water in those basins right now. And so we have an answer. The reason is there's a high water table. Dominic, who's sorry.
Go ahead, Rich.
Brian, who
Yeah.
selected the test pits, the location for the test pits? Dominic or Brian, Scott?
So we talked,
Dominic, you were able to answer that? Is it something you guys do in conjunction, or?
Yeah, I mean, we agreed we would do one in each depression, and while we were out there, we walked out there together and with the excavator and picked a spot. We tried to do them roughly towards the middle of each.
I had asked earlier to have a pit dug in the lower bottom area or bottom location of those pits, which were closer to the boundary with the other soil type, but it was not done.
Brian,
Yes.
I've walked around this property and I can see where the test pits were dug. This was before there was any kind of snow. And I wondered why the test pits were not dug in the middle of the depressions. In fact, they're dug, both of them are dug at the edge.
if I could speak to that, Richard, you're
Mhm.
talking about before the snow. So this was just done recently. These are new test pits, to my understanding.
I saw them the
And
day.
Okay, so there were test pits done for the septics, which were on the edge and in front of these depressions.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about down in the depression itself. Okay. If you look on the plan, there's kind of like a peninsula that kind of reaches out into that's separating the two depressions. Yes. And it was on the inside corner, like the southwest corner of the depression. I'm pointing. Southwest corner of Lot 4 depression. Yeah, right in there is where one of the test pits was done. And the other one was done, just slide over through the end of the floor plan of the house. See where it says 310? See where it's go up, where it says get into the depression. Go into the depression, go down just a skosh and you see 310. Yeah, right in there is where the other one was done. And it's right at the edge. I mean, if I was doing this, I would have gone out into the middle of the thing. Well, why not go out into the middle of it? Because it's filled with water, it's ice. So I just want the board to be aware of this. I have a little bit of problem looking out there and seeing that, that this was done on the edge. And of course, if you're in the kind of on the slope, you will have topsoil that has run in there. In terms of assessing the soil type, could be a little different.
So Richard, to note, actually, and to Bill's point, Bill, actually where Richard is pointing out that the test pits were done on Lot 4, that's actually the area that you pointed out last time that they were supposed to do it, correct?
It is the lower left.
Right.
I think he's talking about they were done right in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brian, Jim does have a question.
So, sorry about that. Just one more question to Dominic, Brian. Would 28 inches of topsoil be classified as a class D for a CN curve?
I don't know the answer. Dominic, do you have an idea? I'm just, I guess, define topsoil.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
Well, what I'm looking at specifically is for the septic system designs. There's soil tests for the septic system designs, and there's 28 inches of topsoil in the application, the last few pages, and it's 28 inches of topsoil. And my question is 28 inches of topsoil, would that constitute a type D soil?
I don't know offhand what the topsoil was classified as. It's not topsoil by itself isn't a thing, I guess, in terms of classifying hydrologic soil groups. There's what they call textural categories: sand, sandy loam, sorry, wrong, sand, loamy sand, sandy loam, loam, silt loam, silty clay loam. I forget where you get as you start getting lower and lower, and eventually hit clay. So it would depend on what the topsoil was made of. Most topsoils are either sandy loams or loamy sands, at least, you know, in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I'm just going back to in the application, there were septic systems that were, it's in the application for the septic systems, and it defines the soil types. And it uses this term called horizon, and it's A.
Yeah, what that is when you do the soil tests, there's, I won't go too far down the rabbit hole here. There's layers and horizons. Call them all horizons for argument's sake. A is basically your topsoil layer, right? Which is where some organics build up and the nutrient, excuse me, the nutrients are for plants. A B is sort of a secondary layer below the A, but it's not what they call the parent material, the real geologic material from back in the glacial periods. And then the C horizons are where you're getting into that parent material. That's the base. So that's just how you categorize these things for the sake of the test pit logs. What dictates whether and what hydrologic soil group they're in is there's probably a column there called texture.
Yeah, I think I do recall that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's where you'll see like different people write them out differently. S for sands, SL for sandy loam, LS for loamy sands, SIL for silty loam.
Okay.
So that's what dictates what the hydrologic soil group is. So even if, excuse me, even if it's topsoil, it will still depend on what that texture is.
Did you get a chance to go look at that as part of the analysis? Here's where
where they're doing the septic systems. No, we didn't do anything with where they're doing the septic.
Right, but in it's there. The definition. Right. Scott Hayes did it, so it's there. Yeah. Right, so you can go look at it. So my question is if you looked at that particular area, would that be classified as a D in the calculations?
I think it might actually be different depending on which septic system you're talking about. If I remember, there was a map from last time of the different soil types or projected soil types. I think most of that was on an A, and there were some ADs, but I think most of the septics fell into an A or were mounted above an A.
Okay.
I was going to say they were all listed as
something different.
They were all listed as sandy loam.
Okay.
So
okay,
yeah, they would not be a D.
Okay, good. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Brian, just as a reminder, I know we are running, and we have a wonderful Parks and Rec group that has had awesome patience during this time.
Appreciate that. Yes. So for Jim and Richard, again, we are going to continue. So if you have additional questions, ask you to bring them with you again that night, or if you can email anything to Rebecca that she can pass along to the applicants so they can prepare any answers, that's always appreciated. But that said, right now, I'm going to make a motion that we continue the public hearing for Century Mill Road map 3.D parcel 75 until our next public hearing, Tuesday, March 16th at 7:15 p.m. Do I hear a second for that?
Second.
All right. All those in favor, starting with Emily? Did we lose Emily?
I'm back.
Ah,
My old computer overheated.
it happens. Are you in favor of
Can't handle these
continuing?
Zoom meetings. It's 8 years old.
Sorry, Emily, are you in favor of continuing until our next public meeting?
Aye.
All right. Bill,
Aye.
Lori,
Aye.
and I'm an aye as well, Rebecca.
Very good.
Very
But just for the record, the applicant dissents.
Thank you.
All right, folks, have a good evening. Thank you.
All right, take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience.
No, thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic.
All right, Rebecca, are you ready for us to continue? Sorry.
I was on mute again. I'm sorry. Yes.
Perfectly fine. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my my documents.
Sure. I'm just sharing my screen with the document as well.
Beautiful.
So I know we do have, so it's an appointment on our agenda, so you don't necessarily, you have to open the discussion, but you don't have to state
Under
the,
Mass General Law.
yes.
So the Bolton Conservation Commission will now officially hold a public discussion regarding the Parks and Recreation property operation and maintenance plans within Conservation Commission jurisdictional areas.
Sure. We do, so I will mention, we do have Parks and Rec representatives present. We have Lisa Sheppel and Ed Sterling, along with possibly some others, and I apologize. But I appreciate your patience. In general, to the Conservation Commission, as we are also working on our operation and maintenance plans for our conservation properties, so isn't Parks and Rec. And we realize that a lot of the Parks and Rec properties actually fall within the jurisdiction of the Conservation Commission. So as we're working through and discussing with one another how we address this, they provided this wonderful overview of each of their properties and where the jurisdiction lies, and wanted to open this discussion with the commission. So I will hand it off to Ed and Lisa, or whichever or whoever you both would like to take the reins on that.
Sure. So Ed Sterling, Chairman of the Parks and Rec. I think we're certainly a little befuddled by the whole process. To be quite honest, when I joined the Parks and Rec, I guess it's getting to be about almost 2 years ago, I had been on in 2002 to 2004, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a sleepy little commission that worried about how many Easter eggs we were going to get and how much candy we were going to buy for the children for Halloween. I have been bowled over by what I've encountered now is a much more complex Parks and Rec Commission with far more duties and responsibilities. So I'm kind of holding on for dear life. But this is, again, a very complicated, I guess, set of requirements and so on that we've been facing. So when this vegetative management plan came across, I guess, our collective desks, I guess the general impression is we've inherited a lot of stuff that we really don't control. The town common, for example, has had a no-cost landscaping contract, if you will, arranged by the trust when they created the common, and we have inherited that. And so we apparently get about $5,000 worth of landscaping, fertilizing, and some herbicide treatments for free. And I guess the feeling is that's wonderful. Thank you for saving saving us $5,000. And then I guess some would say, well, is it really necessary? So I'm not a landscape type myself. I probably have the worst lawn in Bolton, bar none. I'm not the fertilizer, herbicide type of guy myself. But I guess again, having inherited this, the feeling was that all this is goodness going into our lovely, new town common. Certainly in the case of the town common, we have something on the order of, I guess, a 100-year history of disturbance of the area. And I think it was certainly found that a lot of dumping occurred. The good old boys probably poured oil, out back after they changed the oil on the Model T. And it probably went on for a long, long time. Not to disparage them, but, I have to admit I've done something like that myself many, many years ago. And so we scratch our heads a little bit knowing that the stream, has been covered over for years, that the land has been disturbed for years and so on. But that's not to say that, the environment shouldn't be protected in some way. I'm just kind of left scratching my head going, gosh, what do I do? Because if I count the stream, basically the entire town common is obviously within a Rivers Act zone, not to, as well as the 100-foot buffer zone. And when I look at the maps, I believe the entire area, certainly from a Rivers Act, is covered from 117 all the way back into the woods. So that's just the fate of the town common. The sports fields again have had a life of their own. I've been in town 32 years. When I moved here, Memorial Field was really the only sports field. It was used by everybody: basketball, soccer, baseball. And you would find, baseballs flying into the soccer game, soccer balls flying into the baseball game. And then the Bolton Fair would show up and put up all their stuff. And, great big gouges were left in the grass by the heavy equipment, for the Ferris wheel and everything else. Most of that was solved somewhere around 1996 or 7, if I'm not mistaken. With the Bolton Fair changed a lot. It grew. The town began to develop like crazy. Previous parking lots became, housing projects. They became the Bolton Senior Citizen area. That became the Bolton Manor, as we call it. That got developed. The little lacrosse field got taken away. The Hebert's Candy area lot, that again, tremendous parking lot for Bolton Fair. That all got plowed under and had about 3 or 4 different lives. Now, of course, it's a condo project. So we also, as a selectman at the time, 96 to 99, we closed the old Bolton dump where we used to bury the trash. And so we became a transfer station. And in doing so, it was recognized that some land of private citizens had been infringed on by the Bolton dump, if you will, the old dump. And we thought about buying buying some of that land that had been disturbed. And we kind of got a greater vision of the land across the street. We all know there's a stream that flows down Forbush Mill Road. And we looked at that, I think was a bean field at the very bottom, and thought, what would it take to buy the entire area? And part of the thought was, we don't want houses down there. We don't want any more homes than exist for possible fear of leaching out of the old Bolton dump. And so as a selectman at the time, the thought was, gee, if we could get this past town meeting, we'd buy that land, we'd make right for the citizens who own some of the adjacent land that, again, had been infringed on. And we'd have this big flat field that might become a new, recreational field. And so indeed it became the Forbush Mill soccer field. And what a wonderful thing it is today. It's a joy to drive down there, certainly while it's quiet, and to see how nice it is. There again, with the Forbush Mill stream flowing beside it, the entire field is basically certainly the Rivers Act, if not half of it, I'm sure, in the buffer zone, the DEP buffer zone. So here again, we've inherited this. The sports teams have gone off on their own. They've engaged some landscapers, and my understanding is an outfit in Maynard, I think, called Great Gatsby Landscaping. does the Forbush field and does the Memorial Field, and the folks at the little tiny lacrosse field by the Clinton Savings Bank, they would like the same thing, and they haven't gotten there yet, but they would like to do that. So Gatsby has been the, I guess, landscaper of choice for the Bolton sports teams. Here again, the Parks and Rec, I don't think has ever been consulted. I don't think anybody cared, frankly. We were just happy that they were separate, and the baseball guys did their thing and the soccer guys did their thing. And our involvement is essentially just scheduling. And that's, again, something that was never done some 20 years ago. Now we have a little more control. We try to schedule the teams and sort out any conflicts in terms of out-of-towners and Bolton youth sports and so on. So what I tried to describe in the document was taking some of the information we'd received on a spreadsheet about where the locations were, what some of the jurisdiction was, and then basically stating both an actual state of the state in terms of what goes on, and a little history as to what I remember, again, being in town 32 years and holding a number of different positions, Concom, Selectmen, Parks and Rec, try to give you an idea as to what's happened over the years at those locations. So I really am kind of, I'm putty in your hands at this point. You might say, tell me what to do. I've got these sports teams engaging landscapers. There's some thought of, well, we should demarc the wetlands and so on. I'm not sure quite who would do that, how we would do that, and what that would mean for these landscaping companies. So I'm sure we're not the first town to ever run into this. I really haven't gotten anything special out of either landscaping company, having talked to them, in terms of how they deal with working in the wetland area. I tried to provide documentation from what we've received from them in terms of the chemicals that they use, both in terms of fertilizer and herbicides, so that someone with a knowledge of chemicals and so on could possibly make a ruling on whether there's something objectionable in there. My sense is that they're properly licensed companies doing probably lots of work all over the whole area, Bolton yards galore, and I trust they're not doing anything wrong. Now the question is something wrong here? And we really seek your guidance as to what you would like us to do. So that's kind of a real overview of where I think Parks and Rec sits at this point. We're not landscapers. We haven't hired these people. They are on our property. And I guess they're doing the right thing, we hope. But now we need your guidance, and we need to hear your concerns as to what you'd like us to do at this point. What should we do going forward? So that's my opening remark.
Well stated, Ed, too. And by the way, reading through that document over the last day or so, somebody put a lot of work into that too. You guys really did kind of pull it all into one place. Rebecca, do you have initial thoughts on this, or a best way for us that we can handle this or address?
I have a suggestion, and really that's what was behind Parks and Rec needing to come to conservation to exactly what Ed's talking about, seek some guidance on how they can address this. One of the things that stood out and that really initiated this was, for a lot of the properties, there are actually orders of conditions that had been issued for the property and for maintenance of the property because it is within the jurisdiction of the commission. After reading through some of them, though, it seemed to restrict. So I don't know if the guidance at the end of all this is to say we need to make sure that those are current in terms of if there's any areas that come out or go back into restriction or not. For the town common, for example, there may be areas that we want to specify what type of a chemical to be used or a category versus saying none at all. So saying organic or other and being specific about it. I personally don't hold a pesticide license or any of those licenses that are associated with applying the chemical. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm a professional about the different types. And I don't think that it's within the commission or Parks and Rec's purview to really distinguish between the two as far as what's being used, other than to classify of these are sensitive areas, it needs to be organic or no paper products, etc. And or other areas that are not jurisdictional, and therefore it's up to the property owner at that point. But so back to, there are existing order of conditions on the majority of the properties. So what I was explaining is, is the commission still comfortable with what was included in those order of conditions, which is basically what Ed has summarized in each of these pages here. And then issue a certificate of compliance with ongoing conditions. So we know there's no question, a lot of these order of conditions have in fact expired. So issuing the certificate of compliance still can be done once the order of conditions has expired. What we can't do is we can't amend the order. So we can add some continuing conditions, which is very easy to do. But just making sure, and then potentially having Parks and Rec have that document with the ongoing conditions to hand out if they're having a volunteer group or an organization establish who's managing and maintaining the property, handing that to them and saying, by the way, this is here, we need to work within those parameters. Then it in a sense takes a little bit of the burden off their back, where it's the commission's jurisdiction, and they're relaying that to whomever the contracted party is going to be carrying out the work. And then from there, the contracted party can then understand, as I'm sure they deal with other towns, okay, how are we going to address this and still provide a similar result? So I think we have a really good summary here, and I think the commission needs to weigh in on whether or not they're comfortable with that process. If in fact it is, we just need to issue a certificate of compliance. I can work with Lisa and Ed and have a request for certificate of compliance written up for each order of conditions that exists. I think only issue would lie where a property does not have an open order or an order of conditions that includes maintenance, and then we would need to file an order of conditions. It is a municipal property, so it does qualify for an exemption regarding the filing fees.
Yeah.
So as far as cost, I don't think it's going to be significant, but that's really how I see the commission being able to assist in this process. So
I can see.
I'll confess to some cut and paste on some of the wetland resource implications, if you will, the top bullet items that you see. And the cell tower is a good example. If you notice, the DEP filing doesn't have a number. I did not have one, frankly, and I don't know if it exists or not. And that in particular would be one that I would urge, maybe we could, a good example of just going in, is there a filing, and are the restrictions listed here accurate or not? I received a spreadsheet that I don't know, Rebecca, if you had prepared it. It looked as if some, thank you. There were some areas that were not included. And so I think the cell tower was one of those. And so that's a good example of one that probably would need a review, just as an example.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Okay.
Yeah. It strikes me, I'll let other commission members weigh in, but it strikes me that Rebecca has a smart way to proceed. One of the things I can see too, if we start closing out these orders of condition and just setting up ongoing orders or setting up a new OMP going forward, is we should be able to try to standardize them just to try to make your lives easier. So that basically, all athletic fields are going to have the same restrictions or non-restrictions put on. Like, we can have a standard language basically for all the Parks and Rec stuff that falls under jurisdictional areas, just to try to make it easier going forward.
Right. I think Memorial Field is the only area that actually doesn't have some type of water, if I'm not mistaken. I know there's wetland behind Memorial Field near
buffer
Berlin
zone.
Road. The soccer field, Forbush, certainly has a flowing stream. I don't know if it's a flowing stream at the back of the lacrosse field, kind of behind Clinton Savings Bank. It's
There
been,
is.
Yes.
it's been years since I've been back there. Good.
Yeah.
All right. And certainly we have the, the flowing stream underneath the town common. So so those would all, I'm sure, be Rivers Act. I think Memorial Field is just a DEP buffer zone, if I'm not mistaken, and WRPD.
Yep, so it is what you're referring to, because that's not a perennial stream, even though it did flood often because of beaver activity. However, you're correct. There is bordering vegetated wetland there with a 100-foot buffer, and then our local adjacent upland resource area as well, which does allow for maintenance within it. But you're right, Memorial Field is probably, and then some of Horse Ring Field is probably the two properties that you'll see a larger portion that's outside of the commission's jurisdiction, but there is certainly still jurisdiction on those properties.
Right, agreed. So Brian, I agree with you that, there probably could be almost a standard that would cover a number of these athletic fields with flowing water going beside them.
I think
just
it
trying
would
to make
be,
it easy and consistent going forward, hopefully.
I think it would be helpful though, and it could be a cut and paste, but to have the details for each property so that like when Bolton Youth Baseball wants to pull the O&M for Memorial Field, it's not a reference to 4 other documents. It's all in that package. And one thing I was kind of thinking was that this, and this could be general, but as far as like invasive species management goes, there should be specific guidelines for that. And I think throughout town, it's just kind of like, and I'm not talking about on conservation properties, I'm talking about like DPW, aerial, just spraying. So making sure that, what are we using as methods for invasive species management? And that's very clear. And then the fertilizers, I think in general, especially where we have wetlands and streams, those should always be organic. And I don't know if that's what's happening with Gatsby right now. But I do know in talking to like the Bolton Youth Baseball in the past, I don't think there's a lot of like discussion. Like, I don't think that they are aware of the fact that there are wetlands, and, as far as just maintaining the fields go, that information isn't readily available to them. And they're just trying to keep the field going and keep baseball going. And, so having a document like this for each piece of property is fantastic. But in general, as I was reading it, I think if we could add in just some more specifics and really nail down what would be appropriate for fertilizer, it'd be awesome if we didn't have to use fertilizer, but because these are green spaces, that is necessary just to keep them usable and functional. And then I think there was one other, the chemicals, and that's something I feel like we could work with Parks and Rec on and we were doing that for our properties, is coming up with invasive species management practices. But even if it's a cut and paste, just having that under each individual property would be really helpful.
Can you advise us at all on the chemicals that we included? I hope I tried to deliver a package, if you will, to Rebecca, that had all the documents that I was aware of, including some information at Gatsby and the Emerald Acres. Emerald Acres is the no-cost landscaping that was essentially given to the town through the trust and passed on to us. And we actually did approach them, and they came back with kind of a standard, yeah, it's organic. And one of our commission members is a bioscientist, and he looked at it and he said, I guess it's all organic, quote unquote, but not necessarily compost, so to speak. It's definitely a chemical. And we've tried to recover some sheets and stuff that chemical information sheets that came off their bags of stuff that they spread around the common. They do a manual walk around with a little spreader. So I got one of their sheets, and I trust we've been able to give that to you so that somebody could look at it and say, yes, this is okay, or gee, this seems to be harmful. And so there's, again, an area where we kind of don't know what to do, or who's the right person to kind of pass judgment on it. And I don't know the answer to that at the moment, but we were told it's organic. All right.
Okay. So our chair actually just had their Wi-Fi crash, so he may be back or not.
Right.
We do have a quorum still.
Right.
I'm just going to make sure. Yeah, Bill and Lori are still there here.
So that might be just an action item, Rebecca?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, again, I think we can certainly look into the definition of what the commission is establishing as quote unquote organic versus a company establishing as organic, because we do need to be careful with what sort of wording we're putting in documents as well, just to make sure that it's really truly representing what the commission's talking about. Just what, for example, what you were just referring to.
Okay.
But I think I would be able to speak with the commission and you and find out what exactly that language is to be able to nail down what exactly we want to relay.
Okay.
But as far as reading the chemical labels, I happy to do it, but I can't say I have enough experience in that to really provide guidance. And I don't know that the commission does, and that's why I would really, the keywords that we would be using to relay what's expected, I think is a little bit more important. And then we can talk about that, or Parks and Rec can talk about that with the contracted party if they're confused in any way.
Is there any guidance from MACC on something like this?
I will look into that, and that's exactly what I plan to do. I haven't seen any yet, but I assume there has to be something. So I'll definitely look at that.
I think as far as like fertilizers go, as you said, Ed, the organic ones really aren't organic. They're better than the real chemical ones. And the only way to really get organic is if we're going to spread, manure on the fields, which we're not going to do. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because we're trying to maintain these grassy areas. And the other problem is even a natural fertilizer increases the nitrogen and can get into waterways. And with all these properties, being surrounded by streams and wetlands, it's kind of a lose-lose, for those resources anyway. But again, they're all areas that need to be maintained, the common, the ball fields. So I think, as organic as you can get without resorting to spreading manure on the fields is kind of the best that we can do, and it looks like they're being fertilized twice a year. It's not, right. I think most of them were twice a year.
That's correct. I think in the documents, we had a statement that the landscapers have told us that it's like a spring and a fall application. I think possibly a herbicide in the, is it the fall, if I'm not mistaken? So it's just done twice a year.
And I kind of feel like, I mean, on a personal level, I don't really know what else, like I said, without going to a fully organic method, which isn't really practical for these types of spaces. But then when we get into like the herbicides that are used for the invasive species management, that can be more developed. And instead of resorting to spraying, which is easiest and labor-wise cheapest, there are other methods, that can be utilized, whether it's with manpower and volunteer work or cutting and, hand applying the chemical to the root or to the base of the plant. And what Rebecca, actually, I shouldn't say Rebecca's been working on for the conservation properties is addressing each property and kind of thinking about what invasive species are on those properties. And, you know, at the last resort is spraying. If all
Right.
else fails, the last resort is spraying. And I think that's really important on some of these properties where we have waterways and resources. It's important anyway for the environment, but you know, when you get down to thinking about the wetlands and the streams that are around the perimeters of these properties, it's especially important because a lot of the invasive species are along the perimeter of the properties because they're all fields. So when we go in and spray bittersweet, it's just going right into the stream or the wetland.
Agreed. Japanese knotweed, is that, I think, is the town common, I think, the only location we've seen that?
No, I mean, that's the worst I have seen in town, but it is not the only location where
Okay.
it is. For instance, it's along the southwestern most, that's not grammatically correct, so I apologize, but most southwestern portion of Still River, which runs along Forbush Mill Road there into Lancaster. So a significant portion of that field and along the banks of the stream there's a significant amount of knotweed, but luckily the water flows away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's just another area off the top of my head that I know is really just infiltrated with it,
Right.
for lack of a better word.
Okay.
And knotweed is one that you really do have to use chemicals for. There's just, you cannot, you know, bittersweet, you can rip out by the roots if you have enough time and manpower.
Mhm.
Bittersweet and grapevines you can rip out. But the knotweed is one where you can't say we're not going to use any chemicals. It's impossible.
I see.
Yeah, so to Emily's point, right now, the best management practice that I've heard from my counterparts in different organizations that I sit on and boards, the best management practice is in fact to cut and then treat the stems. So it's a direct treatment. It's not like you're spraying in a general area. But that doesn't even get rid of it. It's over time, multiple treatments. I think the best example that they have so far is over a 3-year period of doing that. Then they started to see a reduction. The other thing you can do is completely excavate the area. And even then, when you miss a little bit, it's going to come back.
I see.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
So not always the worst, but to Emily's point, there are definitely others that are more feasible and maybe getting the community involved to help. So if the sports teams want to have, you know, a pull day, this is how we're gonna help out the property. And that's
good idea.
typically along the perimeter of the fields.
Right. Okay.
And I think people would be very receptive to that. You know, I mean, people
Yep.
do volunteer to help with the fields, but I honestly I don't think people are aware that there are, you know, invasive species along there. So I'm sure that would be an awesome community opportunity and to educate too.
Agreed. Okay. There was one document, I think it was prepared by the former chair of Parks and Rec. And it was for Pond Park, and I think it was dated something like 2016. It was extremely detailed. Are you looking for a similar document, if you know the one I'm talking about? I think month by month, there were different steps to be taken. You know, delineating the wetlands, calling the Boy Scouts, and so on. A lot of work went into it. And I was just curious if that was the model that you wanted to follow.
So I believe, Brian, are you on the phone?
I am indeed. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry about
Okay.
that. Hopefully, router's rebooting. We'll see.
Okay.
Thanks, Brian. So Ed, to address your question, that's actually the format that I'm using right now for our conservation properties. And that was something that was created by a past board member of Parks and Rec or commission
Right.
member of Parks and Rec. And there was a substantial amount of work. Now, when it comes to scheduling and relaying to the public what to do when, I think that type of a document is helpful. However, for the purposes of the Conservation Commission relaying the jurisdiction, closing out and issuing certificates of compliance with ongoing conditions for the ones that currently have orders of conditions, or if a new notice of intent is to be submitted for a property that doesn't currently have an order. I don't feel that, I mean, it would be helpful for the commission to understand what's going on when, but I think that's sort of a secondary document.
Okay.
Where originally we want to get the order of conditions in place, including, like Brian said, it may have more standardized language, these newer order of conditions that may be pulled from older orders, but getting that established so then you can, as Parks and Rec, if you wish to put it in a scheduled document, you can almost cut and paste and say, we're using fertilizers, herbicides during this time or not, or we're limiting mowing during this time because of potential for drought, or that type of consideration. But I don't foresee, unless it's in the order of conditions, that's the document that the commission issues, as you're aware from your time on the commission as well.
Right. Right.
So I think for that purpose, I think it's fine to just have the order of conditions or the proposed conditions. And then if Parks and Rec wants afterwards to figure out a schedule and share it with the commission, wonderful.
Okay.
But that's my thinking, but it depends on what the commission would like, obviously.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Right. It was just a lot of detail, and I wasn't sure if it had actually been done. That was one of the curious things. It was done 4 years ago, and
Yeah.
it prescribed many, many steps, and I was kind of at a loss to wonder that anybody had actually taken the proper actions to follow what was in the document. I know from my time in the commission years ago, that was a real frustration, was we write orders of conditions in a Concom, and then it seemed that there wasn't a good system to kind of remind us year by year what the applicant was supposed to do to maintain those proper orders.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
All
I
right,
call
thank
them now. I call them now to check up.
Right. That would be wonderful, believe me.
Yep.
Okay.
I think now too, where the vegetation maintenance plan, management plan that DPW was working on references, it's a very short, concise piece there, maybe 1 or 2 sentences in it that says reference maintenance plan from Parks and Rec and Concom. That says right there, every year we're gonna get a reminder of, okay, any changes? No. All right, next one. And for Parks and Rec, the restriction shouldn't change unless suddenly there's a regulation change at the state or at the local level under the commission's jurisdiction. So that's sort of the easy part, is it's a lot of upfront work, but I think once we get it addressed and those conditions in perpetuity, there won't be an issue in the future.
How would you like to go forward? What should we have some small one-on-ones? Myself or Lisa sitting with you, going over individual properties sort of step by step, or do we need more from these landscaping companies in some way?
So I would say my suggestion, as I stated before, and the chair can, and the rest of the commission can choose if this is how they wish to proceed or suggest to proceed, is number 1, find out what properties have orders of conditions, which I believe we have, the majority of them, if not all, and fill out a document for each, which is very intuitive, but if there's a question, I can certainly explain or answer a question on how to fill out that form. For request for certificate of compliance for each of the ones with certificates, with orders of conditions. So I would start with that. And then the next step is, if there are properties without, we need to file notice of intent for the ones that fall under the commission's jurisdiction to get an order of conditions in place. And then we'll do the same thing with that property. Is you can, once the order of conditions is issued, you can let it go for 3 years. And then we'll do the certificate of compliance, or you can do it right away in this circumstance as well.
Okay.
So I think that's the best way to start, because by getting the requesting the certificate of compliance, you're going to essentially have the commission request the commission to issue those ongoing conditions, which we will then potentially be able to rework into the notice of intent.
Okay.
As long as you're comfortable with it, or the restrictions that are in place maybe on some properties don't make sense, that don't currently have an order. So you then have a little bit of flexibility on suggesting new items.
Okay.
Becca, do the order of conditions that exist have plans for the various properties?
Yep.
Okay, 'cause I think that would be helpful to include in the O&M packages for each property, for when you have other groups that are taking part in some of the management that may not be aware that there are wetlands adjacent, or what the offset for the stream is. But to have that with the property O&M manual, if it already exists. And I didn't want to suggest that Parks and Rec now has to hire somebody to delineate everything. But
Yeah.
if one doesn't exist, could an aerial photograph, just, with even handwritten, hatched out, or using the GIS maps, and just showing where wetlands exist roughly, or where the stream exists roughly, and then hand drawing or computer drawing just an offset from that, just as a visual aid for any local organizations that are taking part in managing those properties.
Yeah, I definitely think we can create maps from the GIS information we have. That's fairly simple. And that's something I could do. However, and just like the existing delineations that are there, it's more of a guideline since they're out of date at this point, but it still provides, because a lot of the fields are basically defined by topography there and the resource areas. It's fairly easy to confirm that, yes, they are still accurate, or no, they're not. So I guess that would be the only thing I'd be concerned with, is really it's up to the commission whether or not they accept that as a plan, which it sounds like they'd be comfortable with for this purpose. But it'd really be if DEP had any problems with that, which they may not. Typically, if there's a scale on it, which we can make sure it's a scaled map, but it just wouldn't be a full scaled plan that we typically receive. So, and I can talk to DEP and sort of see if they would accept that for this purpose under the notice of intent filing, but that's the only question I guess I would have. But locally, if the commission decided, yes, that's acceptable, I think that's certainly fine.
So again, to kind of get things going, do something, positive.
Mhm.
You've been generous and given us quite a thick file of a number of the, the different filings that you've had in the past. So would you like us then to go back into that file packet and look at the properties, double check that there was a filing at some point, and see what the order of conditions states and whether it's valid or not? Is that the best way to proceed? No, we take, or should we work with you, like Lisa and I, perhaps one of the two of us comes and meets with you?
Yeah, and it can be as simple as that. I think even just looking on the spreadsheet, I think I listed whether or not something had an order of conditions.
We
and
tried to map that, yes.
Yeah, so if it's a yes, then you start filling out the document for a request for COC. If it's a no, or if it's blank, then we'll have to work together to do a second look for the file. And if there's not already an existing order of conditions, then we can meet and work on that. But I think, I think the easiest is just to look on that spreadsheet and then start filling out I think it's a 1 or 2 page document. I'll send the link to you and Lisa tomorrow. But
okay.
Yep.
All right.
And that is most likely going to be cut and pasting for you, and then just typing in the map in parcel.
All right.
Mhm.
Okay.
Rebecca, was that document for every property, or did some have it already and some didn't, or?
So some did and some didn't. So the Excel spreadsheet that I sent, I don't think had every property, but just the ones I had in my file or the ones that I was familiar with off the top of my head when I was making it. So
Lisa, I'll be glad to sit with you and we can go through those files from Rebecca, and I'll match that to the document that I provided to the Concom.
Okay,
How's that?
sounds good.
All right.
Okay, so we have a starting point. So we meet,
Right.
March 16th is our next meeting date. I don't know, do you have a particular timeline, Ed or Lisa, regarding when this should be done by?
I'll be honest, no, I don't.
Okay,
Well, so the only thing we have to be careful about is soccer and baseball want to have it fertilized before they start. So if we have to do this before that gets done, then I don't know if it's sometime in March or April that they want it done. So baseball seasons would start probably the end of April, May 1st. Soccer season is starting the middle of April.
so if you could, for the
All right.
sports that you know are looking to continue, if you could send me the name of the fields just in response to the email I send you or separate, and then I'll look through the order of conditions and I can just simply go through and highlight if in fact it has an order of conditions for that property, and then you can just share that with them and say, by the way, you can, but you have to meet these parameters on site.
Okay.
And it's a document, if it's already been issued, it's already been issued and it's been in place, so.
It would be Memorial and Forbush, and
right.
they're both done by Gatsby too, which
Yeah.
he's been doing them for the past couple of years. And I think he's aware of the areas that you're talking about too.
Right.
Yeah, and I did talk to Gatsby at least on Memorial, so I do know that they're aware of at least Memorial, so.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
I'm guessing they're using the same mix of fertilizer for both properties, right?
I think so.
I would certainly think so.
Yeah, I think so.
I would assume.
Probably for all of their contracts in the town, they're probably using the same thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. All right.
And we do have those sheets too, but like,
Yes.
we don't know what it means. I don't know anybody,
Part of our problem.
yeah, in town,
Yeah.
if they know what it means or not, but.
Right.
Okay.
All right.
So, Brian, I'll hand it back to you.
All right. It sounds like we have a plan moving forward.
I think so.
Okay. Well, I was going to say I can poll commission members, but the idea of looking at the properties and working with Rebecca to try to revise and update, is that something we can just move forward with? I understand the concerns about the ball fields that probably need fertilization relatively soon. But could we possibly start with those and take a look?
Right. The two major fields, right? The Memorial and Forbush.
Yeah, if those are the ones we think are probably going to be needing fertilization relatively soon, that would seem like those would be the first ones to try to update.
That's correct. That's correct. Yep. Town Common would probably be the next one after that, and that's called Emerald Acres Company that handles that one.
All right. And are you comfortable, Rebecca, were you able to basically sit and meet and start going through these so that we can basically try to approve them at our next meeting?
Yes, so certainly for the three that they've highlighted, I can definitely read through those order of conditions before our next meeting, and just highlight any limitations in particular on those properties. But the other side of that is making sure just confirming if Lisa and Ed have questions about which ones have orders of conditions, and then requesting the COC via the document I was referring to. That's I
Right.
can definitely work on both of those.
Okay.
Mhm.
And other commission members fine with that as a way to start proceeding on this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so Rebecca, we really don't need to vote on anything tonight with this, do we?
No.
Okay. So we have an idea how to move forward, and next meeting we may be taking up well, especially the properties that we had mentioned before, but we can start checking these off going forward.
Definitely.
Okay. All right. Barring any further comments at this point in time, I think we'll move on through the agenda.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Good night now.
Night.
Bye.
All right, thank you.
We have minutes, Brian.
Yep. Did commission members have a chance to review the February 16th meeting minutes? And if so, does anybody have any changes, comments, questions, issues?
No.
No issues.
All right. Hearing none, I had none myself. I'd like to make a motion that we approve the meeting minutes for our February 16th, 2021 meeting as drafted and submitted at this evening's meeting. Do I hear a second for that?
Second.
All right. All those in favor, starting with Emily,
Aye.
Bill,
Aye.
Lori,
Aye.
and Rebecca, I'm an aye as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Any update on our land steward position other than it's still out there?
Still out there.
Okay.
And then the only update I had for I was expecting to have an update for the Taggart property. I don't at this time. Again, just a reminder that we'll be doing some property boundary marking and land stewardship efforts March into probably the first or second week of April throughout the Oaks Conservation Area. We will be doing an invasive species poll on March 15th. I'm still organizing that right now with our TerraCore member. And lastly, I had emailed everyone just to give you a couple updates that I changed on our operation maintenance plan draft, but I'm still working on those, so I will have them for the March 16th meeting. But I really don't have any in-depth changes aside from the suggestions of putting the invasive species on each of the properties, so where we're aware of sort of the major issues. And then best management practice links to it from the document itself, and the slight formatting change that I also included.
Okay. Any commission members have any additional updates or any new business? Not hearing any. I would go ahead and make a motion that we adjourn our March 2nd, 2021 meeting of the Bolton Conservation Commission. Do I hear a second for adjournment?
I second.
All right. All those in favor, starting with Emily.
Aye.
Bill.
Aye.
Lori.
Aye.
And Rebecca, I am an aye as well. Thank you all for everything. Sorry that I could not join you via Zoom for the second half of the meeting. Apologize for dropping out like that. But thank you all for everything, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Take care.
Aye.